because if Raychel and I were going to be characters from any type of a movie, like a cartoon, we would be joy and sadness from the Pixar movie Inside Out. Yes. And sometimes I think that we could each flop spots depending on the day.
Oh yeah, for sure. We could also be some of the other characters
as
well,
but,
depending on the day. But
I am typically joy and Raychel is straight up sadness. She even has a sadness pose that we do in the office.
It's the overwhelm pose, honestly, more than anything.
Really is. And I mean, her whole body, it's like all of a sudden she becomes part of the chair. And the look on the face of the character who plays sadness when she's like laying on the floor and joy is dragging her around.
Yes.
That is the look Raychel actually gets on her face when the sadness pose happens.
Yep.
And it's really funny and we laugh about it. But
my favorite part is when she touches all the balls and turns all the joy into sadness. And she's like, stop it.
I have to watch that movie. I haven't watched it for so long. So anyway, all that to say, to our dear friend and listener, Joelle, we feel your question. Like we absolutely feel your question. And so by no means are we trying to make fun of the question at all. This is how we deal with sadness. We bring in some joy and we laugh about it. Like that's really how we deal with it. So Joelle's question is, how do you find joy after going through seasons of sadness? I want to believe nothing bad is going to happen around the corner, but most of my life has been filled with grief. And
such a heavy question.
Right? It's such a good question. Like an honest, vulnerable question, really. Yep. And I get it. Like I think most of my life, like growing up, even though I had cystic fibrosis, it was easy for me to be filled with joy because I already knew the problems I was going to have. It was going to be cystic fibrosis.
Right.
And then when I became an adult and went through some things in my late 20s and early 30s, now all of a sudden I have this of what if something bad happens again?
Right. Yeah.
What then? Like, I know I'll make it through, but what is my plan? Right. And so I think there are a lot of different ways to answer this question.
Yes.
And Joelle, we really want to just give you some things to think about today. Any of our listeners who have felt the same way, that's really what we want to do, is give you some new perspectives to consider. We want to share with you how we find joy after a season of sadness, and really even how we find joy during a season of sadness.
Is, I think, super important.
It is. I don't think it's either or. I think you can actually have both joy and sadness, maybe not happiness and sadness at the same time, but they're very different. So we want to kind of dive into this. But Raychel, I want you to talk a little bit about what you shared with our inner circle members, because we actually talked about this.
We did.
A little bit.
We did. So the advice that I gave our inner circle members was, it really came down to prepared over panic. And when we talk about the concept of grief, especially for me, I actually really enjoy talking about the concept of grief. Like if you,
she's sadness.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole point to it. Like we didn't just pick this because we thought it was funny to be joy and sadness. But if you've read the book that actually inspired the podcast, She Who Overcomes, there is a second edition to the book, and I wrote the foreword to that book. And in that, I talk about grief. And if you think about grief as a bigger concept than just losing somebody, but losing a job, change, friendships that die, like anything that dies in your life has a grief process to it. So if you put this in like a bigger concept where it's not only like loss of people, but loss in general, it can feel like one hit after another, after another, after another. And I think really right now, if we are talking like real time, the last 2 years have been nothing but loss. They have been nothing but grief. They have been nothing but change over and over and over again. And so one of the things that we were talking about in Inner Circle is, it really comes down to the choices that you have, whether or not you're going to be prepared or you're going to panic. There's always, I think, a little bit of panic when it comes to grief and change. Like that's normal. Like we're not saying that like unexpected things are not going to cause panic. But I think you even touched on a little bit, Mandy, like when you know you've gone through something before, if you've gone through grief in any level before, you kind of have this knowing inside that you can do it again. Yes, it sucks. Yes, it's going to be hard. Yes, grief is like nothing anybody wants to go through. But the thing about grief is there is usually an endpoint, and not an endpoint that you never are thinking about that loss again, but an endpoint where it's not the same kind of heaviness to carry. Like your capacity to deal with it is better. And I think that comes down to that preparedness part. Like, and it's not like we can prepare, like we don't have a list of like, here's 5 ways to prepare for grief. Like there's no way to really do that. But sometimes preparedness just comes down to, I mean, we talked about super like, we were talking about money actually when we were talking about this with the inner circle. And sometimes it's really practical things. Like if you are panicking that something around the corner is going to be another financial disaster, well, have you prepared and learned the lesson from the last financial disaster? So sometimes it really does come down to what have you learned in the past, and have you changed behaviors or attitudes or tasks or anything that can help you be better prepared for the future. So say, you know, you had when last year when we couldn't find toilet paper anywhere, or we couldn't find, you know, cleaning supplies or all of these kinds of things. Like what have you changed in your life to help you better prepare for the future? And for me, when those moments of panic come in, it's that stuff that kind of regrounds you, like brings you back to reality, back to earth, that you're like, oh yeah, that's right. I can do this again. And honestly, from like a spiritual level, I was looking through Unbroken the other day, going through content for the leadership books. And there's, I don't know what day it is, so I couldn't even tell you, but I have a section in there that talks about how King David went through this process. And there was like a certain thing that he did through the Psalms. Is if you look through the Bible, in the book of Psalms, most of them were written by King David. He had a process that he went through every time he went through grief or change in his life. And it was really his way to remind himself of not only God's promises, but like the preparedness. And to not panic. He would literally just keep reminding himself of things of the past, of like strength in his own, own ability as king, but also with God and his promises. So if you are a person of faith, that is somewhere you can dive into too, and kind of just from a bigger concept of being prepared.
Well, and I think too, like the thing to keep in mind, because there definitely are going to be listeners who are like, gosh, why do you always expect bad things to happen? Like, I don't do that. You need to change your mindset and stop expecting things to happen. And the thing about that is having a positive mindset is important. However, when your experience has been bad things happen that I didn't cause, right? Like bad things just happened to me and I wasn't prepared for them. Now you have a level of trauma that you weren't aware of.
Right.
And so just telling yourself to be positive doesn't always help. Like that can sometimes turn into the toxic positivity that is kind of a buzz right now, but also a real thing. So if you are working on your mindset, even remembering, like thinking, okay, I made it through that, which means I'm fully capable of making it through again. But just like you said, Raychel, what can I be prepared with so that it doesn't rock me?
Right.
Or if you know that you have been working on overcoming the trauma of your past. And so you already know what your triggers are. You already know what times of year maybe are harder for you.
Knowledge is part of that preparedness.
It is. Like if you already know that about yourself, then definitely sit down when things are going well and say, okay, if this ever happened again, or if something ever happened like this again, this would be my plan.